Friends, thank you. It's wonderful to be with you. I did think for a moment that we might change this to a buffet of items from the introductory volume, but I know everybody's already hungry for lunch. So I know that you're already going to be waiting for that. In addition, I'm certain that some of you are probably thinking, why do I need another introductory volume to the New Testament on my bookshelf? Put another way, you're probably asking, why do I need another Latter-day Saint introduction to the New Testament, as some great volumes have been published recently? First, I want to assure you that these questions have been on the forefront of our minds through the entire editing process. In many ways, this has given the volume that I get the opportunity to briefly preview with you today an identity and a purpose. It was these concerns that motivated Kent Brown and I to narrow these questions into a single inquiry, namely, what is the utility of the introductory volume of the Brigham Young University New Testament Commentary Series? This question, posed with the entire commentary series in mind, is at the center of our discussion today and is the focus of the edited volume. When thinking about the introductory volume itself and its utilization within the commentary series that we intend to have in your hands by the end of the year, I am taken back to my childhood and my exposure to The Wizard of Oz. I have often been impressed by the scene that L. Frank Baum describes in Oz's throne room when Dorothy and her company of companions discover the truth of who Oz really is. In bewilderment, Dorothy interrogates Oz to try and discover how he was able to impress so many people in the kingdom that he was a great wizard, prompting Oz to respond in resignation, "Step this way, please, and I will tell you all about it." Similarly, like Dorothy to Oz, as a scholar of the New Testament, I have often been interrogated when it comes to information that I publish. Questions such as, how did you get that out of the biblical text? Where did you learn that? Or how can I learn from the scriptures in that way? When confronted with these questions, I often respond to the inquiring individual with the phrase that appeared above the entrance to Dodd Hall at Florida State University, where I did my doctoral studies. The half of knowledge is to know where to find knowledge. Now, my intention in drawing this comparison between Dorothy and Oz is not to make anyone think that we as the scholarly team behind the series are hiding behind a curtain. Please don't feel that way. Though sometimes I think we would when we have deadlines that are coming up. But instead, I want to illustrate that our purpose in writing an introductory volume is to invite all in to see the devices at our disposal in writing and to illuminate the text of the New Testament. Put more directly, the purpose of the introductory volume of the BYU New Testament Commentary Series is to act as an invitation to all to learn more deeply from the New Testament texts by familiarizing the student of the series with the context of the world of the New Testament, to introduce readers to the oldest and most accurate textual sources of the New Testament, to contextualize the King James translation within the history of biblical translations and the restored gospel of Jesus Christ, and to serve as an introduction to some of the methods and modern resources used by our scholars in producing their individual commentary volumes, with a particular focus on topics of interest to Latter-day Saints. In many ways, the introductory volume serves as a reference guide to studying the series itself. It answers questions that may come up in the study of the commentaries and provides a resource for better understanding key areas of study that are brought together to make the BYU New Testament Commentary Series distinct from all other New Testament commentaries. In our time together today, I would like to briefly introduce those areas of study and how they address. Sorry about that, Elder Callister. That's going to be the next one. I slid that in there. I want to introduce this. I would like to briefly introduce these areas of study and how they are addressed in the introductory volume, and articulate how the introductory volume ties together the whole commentary series, enhancing one's study of the New Testament and the commentary volumes, both published and forthcoming. So I'll outline that. At the start, we want to announce, we want to announce, Elder Callister, we're going to include your remarks today in the volume as you fill a needed portion of how the New Testament and the Book of Mormon will work together. And so your piece that we all have the great privilege of being able to see will be included among the introductory volume. In addition, we'll have 4 parts to the introductory volume that will follow this organization. And you can see the 4 parts are focused fairly chronologically in their nature, starting with context and history of the New Testament, moving into various manuscripts and translations of the text, then a lengthy discussion on the King James Version and why we can still cherish that as a valuable resource in studying the New Testament, and then ending with Latter-day Saint encounters with the New Testament and its scholars. So to start, in part 1, which we've entitled The Meridian of Time, How the New Testament Fits Its World, one of the primary purposes in producing the New Testament commentary series was to provide the students of the New Testament a collection of works that illuminates both the historical and cultural settings of this scripture for Latter-day Saints. This objective is the focus of part 1 of the introductory volume. Part 1 consists of 6 articles that set the stage for any study of the New Testament. Throughout the commentary series, notes and analysis of each pericope have rely heavily upon information relating to historical and cultural context. The contributions in part 1 of the introductory volume will greatly aid the reader as it provides broad histories of the world of the New Testament, whereas the individual volumes of the series often hone in on just a part of that history. The first article in part 1 is Historical Background of the New Testament by John Hall, Eric Huntsman, and Cecilia Peake. This piece is focused on orienting the student to the Judean, Hellenistic, and Roman contexts of the New Testament texts. As John Hall points out, the literal Latin meaning of context is within the text. In other words, the sense of this term points to that which must be known alongside the words of the text in order to know how to understand the text itself. Said another way, the world of the author, the personal considerations about the author, and the intent of the author in writing are essential in determining factors in comprehending the meaning of any given text. Hall's observation is then expounded upon as the authors situate the New Testament within the Jewish, Huntsman, Hellenistic, Peake, and Roman, Hall contexts that help students better understand how the context leads to better understanding the scriptural texts themselves. The second offering in part 1 is Avram Shannon's To the Jew and Also to the Gentile, Cultural Context for the New Testament. While Huntsman, Peake, and Hall sought to provide the historical background to the New Testament, Shannon's contribution is focused on the cultural influences on the New Testament authors, such as eschatology, the study of the end of times, apocalypticism, orality, literacy, the various sects of Judaism in the Second Temple period, religious activities within the Roman Empire, and the impact of societal norms regarding gender roles and slavery, which we already heard a little bit about today. Shannon emphasizes that the authors and audiences of the various New Testament books were part of their cultural world, even as they sought to transcend it through the gospel and teachings of Jesus Christ. The third article in part 1 is John Gee's New Testament authorship. This article contains a treasure trove of information relating to each of the texts of the New Testament. Looking at the question of authorship broadly, Gee seeks to provide a comprehensive source for students of the New Testament that catalogs in one location the earliest considerations of who authored each of the New Testament books. Concluding, in general, Brigham Young University's New Testament commentary series will follow the early Christians on their matter of authorship. While questions of authorship are tackled in each individual volume of the series, Gee's article collects individual discussions into a single place. Next, the introductory volume of the New Testament commentary series also serves as a resource for Latter-day Saints to contextualize and address questions or concerns that may be faced when reading the New Testament with a critical eye for the first time. The fourth article of part 1, Brent Schmidt's Digging into the Synoptic Gospels, How Matthew, Mark, and Luke Fit Together, addresses the questions that often arise in a chronological reading of the New Testament. Namely, why do the first 3 Gospels look so much alike? When students do that in my classes, I start to get in problems, but I guess with the text we're okay with that, right? And what do we do when there are contradictions? Seeking to inoculate the reader to what is commonly referred to as the synoptic problem, Schmidt strategically presents the questions that come when viewing the synoptics together, especially when they contradict one another, and concluding that for Latter-day Saints, it is extremely helpful to remember that these synoptic gospels are truly testimonies. As testimonies, they present basic facts of Jesus' ministry that fit nicely together. Their disagreement about certain aspects of Jesus' ministry does not detract from their grand purpose in teaching that Jesus is the Messiah or the Christ. Continuing on the theme of inoculation against questions or concerns that might arise while studying the New Testament, the fifth contribution in part 1, Schmidt again writes on a topic that's often discussed, which is the Pauline epistles. Entitled Embracing Paul's Epistles, an Introduction to the Question of Authorship. While the historical record clearly agrees that Paul authored letters to various Christian congregations throughout the ancient Mediterranean world, scholars often argue over which of the number of letters attributed to Paul are actually written by him. Outlining the arguments made by scholars today concerning the Pauline epistles and contextualizing the arguments with general scholarship and Latter-day Saint teachings, Schmidt's contribution helps to organize individual discussions on Pauline authorship in each of the commentary series volumes, as is evident by the discussions in both Hebrews and Ephesians that have already been published. The final contribution to part 1 of the introductory volume is S. Kent Brown's Educating New Testament Audiences. In this article, Brown seeks to contextualize the audiences who were the first recipients of the New Testament texts and argues that early Christian literature shows that Christian church leaders saw that one of their primary responsibilities was to instruct their fellow church members on how to follow Christ as their spiritual model. Brown's article helps students of the New Testament to look at these texts from the perspective of training and education, giving modern readers a new lens through which to engage in their own exploration of the text as the student at the feet of a teacher. The second part we've entitled How the New Testament Came to Be, The Long Path to Modern Translations. While providing Latter-day Saints with the cultural and historical setting of the New Testament is not unique in the realm of New Testament commentaries, the BYU New Testament Commentary Series is distinct as it provides Latter-day Saints a new translation of the New Testament. These translations, called renditions, aim to enhance readers' understanding conceptually and spiritually by rendering the Greek text into modern English with LDS sensitivities in mind. Unlike any other commentary, these renditions of the New Testament are intended to be vehemently faithful to the ancient sources, while at the same time providing insights into the text that are peculiar to Latter-day Saints, that then easily transition to notes and analysis that are readily recognizable by the reader. In each volume of the commentary series, the authors provide a new rendition of the text and provide notes to further explain their reasoning as to their connection to the Latter-day Saint teachings. In part 2 of the introductory volume, each article is intended to help orient the reader to the field of New Testament textual studies, helping them clarify how one utilizes disparate manuscripts to come to a better understanding of the most reliable and faithful text. Eric Huntsman's article, Greek Manuscripts and Later Translations, opens part 2 with a master class on how ancient Greek manuscripts, including those older than the text utilized in the production of the King James Version, have informed modern translations to improve our understanding of the New Testament Greek text. While there are significant differences between the various ancient Greek manuscripts, Huntsman concludes the doctrinal impact that these differences make is minimal. Nevertheless, it is worth emphasizing that employing all the Greek manuscripts available helps to establish a sure foundation upon which the new rendition can be built. The second article in part 2 is Textual Criticism, How Scholars Attempt a Restoration of All Things Textual by John Gee. This comprehensive yet accessible study helps to show how the copying of manuscripts introduces errors and divergent readings over time. Gee emphasizes that when working with a plethora of Greek manuscripts, the more cautious, responsible approach is to limit ourselves to readings that are attested in the manuscripts, not because they are perfect, but because as mere scholars we should not trust ourselves to rewrite them. I can attest to that very well. This caution then leads into a detailed discussion of the various types of changes and corruptions that have been introduced into the New Testament over centuries of copying, and provides an explicit examples of where textual criticism helped to clarify and restore the best readings of the text, especially as it relates to doctrines peculiar to Latter-day Saints. The third contribution in part 2 is Tom R. Roberts' The Open Canon and the Modern Reader. Here, Roberts introduces the students to the New Testament concept of canon, or to the process by which texts are selected or excluded from the authoritative writings of a Christian community. Roberts explains the history and disputes the influenced opinions relating to Old and New Testament canons throughout early Christianity, strategically showing the modern reader that the canon was fixed and fixable in the literature that was used in Judaism and early Christianity. The fourth contribution to part 2 is an overview of pre-modern New Testament translations by Andrew Skinner. This comprehensive history of translations of the New Testament text provides a valuable timeline of how the New Testament spread across the world in the vernacular tongues of Christians. Biblical scholars will frequently rely on pre-modern translations to provide greater context and understanding to difficult passages in the New Testament. These translations in various languages are of great advantage to all of us in our era of seeking to understand the history and interpretation of Scripture. The penultimate article in Part 2 is Weighing the Authority of the New Testament on Restoration Scales, again by Andrew Skinner. Here, Skinner opens with a series of questions related to how one should view the authority of the New Testament text as it relates to doctrine, commandments, and covenants. Exquisitely exploring the text of the New Testament for statements relating to authority and the history of scholarly inquiry on the matter, Skinner concludes that the scholars working on the present commentary project began their work with the assumption that the authorship in the books of the New Testament, as well as the authority they ascribe to them, are accurate and proper, unless there is evidence to the contrary. In other words, the burden of proof exists on the parts of those who deny the authority traditionally ascribed to the biblical text. This conclusion assures the reader that the texts being analyzed in each volume of the series have authority and meaning in our lives. Friends, as one who's recently finished graduate school, I love that idea, that we still view these texts as authoritative in a world that is trying to minimize the authority that such texts have. In the final offering of Part 2 of the introductory volume is a co-written piece by S. Kent Brown and David J. Larson entitled The Rise of Canonical and Apocryphal Literature. This work, that complements Roberts' previously discussed piece on the history of canonization. In addition to reiterating key historical points, the main focus of this article is exploring the works deemed as apocryphal and their contribution to our study of the New Testament. Looking at both the Old Testament apocryphal works quoted or alluded to in the New Testament and the production and circulation of apocryphal New Testament texts, Brown and Larson conclude that such works, while enticing, add very little to our understanding of the New Testament and need not be a focus within the commentary series itself. Moving to Part 3, which we've entitled The King James Version and Beyond, while the BYU New Testament commentary series aims to provide a new rendition of the New Testament text, this new rendition clarifies that it does not seek to replace the authorized KJV adopted by the Latter-day Saints as the official English text of the church. Friends, again, just reiterating that fact that we stand in complement rather than opposition. This is a foundational element to the BYU New Testament commentary volumes. In Part 3 of the introductory volume, each contribution seeks to provide a better understanding of the King James Version of the New Testament and its place in the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. Andrew Skinner's A Bible for a King, How We Got the King James Version, is the opening article to Part 3 and provides a detailed history of the coming forth of the King James Version of the Bible, viewing it as a forerunner, preparing the way for the establishment of the dispensation of the fullness of times, and a translation that nothing has quite yet hit the high water mark left by it. The second contribution in Part 3 is Navigating the Textus Receptus, Understanding the Text upon which the King James translation rests, by Eric D. Huntsman, and this explores the history of the compilation, collection, and publication of Greek texts that create a less than ideal but sufficiently adequate basis for the King James Bible's translation of the New Testament. Illuminating the staying power of the King James Version of the Bible among English-speaking Latter-day Saints by Andrew Skinner serves as the third article in Part 3 of the introductory volume and situates the King James Version among various English translations available to all of us today, now at the click of a mouse rather than at the bookstore. Skinner follows the timeline of the rise and fall of the KJV, including reasons why various congregations have moved away from the translation. He then contrasts this history with reflections on why this version is loved and revered by Latter-day Saints, and how readers of the new BYU New Testament commentary series benefit greatly by its inclusion. John W. Welch's article, A King James Vocabulary Lesson, is the fourth contribution to Part 3 and walks the reader through a two-part exercise to better understand the KJV text. I call it an exercise because when I went through it, I said, I need to do more of this, and I need more exercise as it is too. First, Welch emphasizes our need to exercise intellectual humility when reading the King James text, as words might not mean what we think they mean due to archaic definitions and shifted meanings over time. The reader is then presented with a series of commonly misunderstood words that, when properly understood, exponentially increase our understanding of the text. The final contribution of part 3 in our introductory volume is Andrew Skinner's making sense of all those New Testament translations, why and how they differ. Building on the history of the King James Bible articulated throughout this part of the introductory volume, Skinner not only lists the various English translations, but outlines the ideology of the translators and how that impacts the presentation of each New Testament text. Coming to our final part of the introductory volume, which we've entitled Latter-day Saints Encounter the New Testament and Its Scholars, the BYU New Testament Commentary Series is most unique in that the commentary series aims to connect helpful elements of linguistic, literary, historical, and cultural research and traditional scholarship together with Latter-day Saint scriptures and doctrinal perspectives. In part 4 of the introductory volume, we shift to discussions related specifically to the restored gospel and the distinct contributions that the restoration provides to each volume of the series. The first article in part 4 is Seeing into God's Own Bosom, a quotation from Doctrine and Covenants 35:20, a brief journey through the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible by Richard Draper. Here, the reader is introduced to the Joseph Smith translation and how the BYU New Testament commentary volumes incorporate the inspired doctrinal expansions and additions from the prophet Joseph Smith. Because components of the JST are woven throughout the commentary volumes, this article is invaluable in contextualizing how the JST works alongside the King James and the new renditions that each volume provides. Now, you've probably been wondering, why am I standing here? Now we get to that point. The next article in part 4 is my own work, titled From Catechism to Come Follow Me, a history of facilitating Latter-day Saints study of the New Testament. In this exhaustive study, I attempt to show how the Church has produced and distributed resources to aid Latter-day Saints in their study of the New Testament. Starting in the mid-1800s, this charts how these study resources have both aligned and contradicted contemporaneous trends of studying the New Testament, and how they have contributed to a New Testament literacy among Latter-day Saints, especially with Come Follow Me, which we've had an example to see 2 iterations of over the last 4 years. Tom R. Roberts' LDS Scholarship Encounters the World of the Bible is the next piece that follows, and provides a genealogy of the academic study of the New Testament by Latter-day Saints. Beginning with the 19th century explorations of Orson Pratt and B.H. Roberts, through James E. Talmage's Jesus the Christ in the early 20th century, Roberts eventually comes to the present age through Hugh Nibley and other influential scholars who began to engage New Testament academic studies. Coming to the present day, Roberts outlines the contributions that are being made by Latter-day Saint scholars in the field of New Testament research, including many of the authors of the BYU New Testament Commentary Series volumes themselves. The final contribution in the introductory volume is Kelsey Draper Lambert's and John S. Thompson's Tracking New Testament Study Among Latter-day Saints. And this is an updated history of Latter-day Saint studies in the New Testament, categorizing Latter-day Saint studies of the New Testament according to general purposes they aim to accomplish, rather than categorizing them along lines of engagement with acceptance of secular premises. Draper and Thompson then catalog Latter-day Saint New Testament scholarship along the lines of translation and transmission of New Testament text, historical and cultural context, the life and ministry of Jesus Christ, the lives and ministries of other New Testament figures, the primitive church and apostasy, temple and ritual studies, and textual commentaries, including the wonderful series that we're celebrating today. In conclusion, the introductory volume returns us to the questions posed at the beginning of our discussion. Why do we need another introductory study to the New Testament? I cannot answer this question for you, but I can say that the introductory volume of the BYU New Testament Commentary Series is an integral part of the commentary series as a whole. It provides a broader perspective on detailed discussions that are written within each volume, and ultimately ties the commentary series together as a holistic project. Thank you.